may they be acceptable and pleasing in thy sight, O Lord. May they truly be pleasing and acceptable in thy sight. You who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This evening we are going to talk about this attitude that Jesus exemplifies, which some have called non-striving. We're in this basic humanity series. What does it mean for us to be basic, just getting to the basics of what it means to be the human beings that God created us to be. And so one of those attitudes that we're supposed to be exemplifying as we follow Jesus Christ is non-striving. Another way to put this is that there is no thing to get in life. Henry Nouwen calls this downward mobility. While the world is upward mobility, this is downward mobility. Non-striving moves us into the practice of waiting on God. So this evening we're going to talk a little bit about waiting on God. So if that were going to be the title, instead of just plain non-striving, I would go with waiting on God. I messaged with one of my friends just a few minutes ago and said, I was thinking about the title Waiting on God, or in other words, I'm completely hypocritical about what I'm just about to preach to you about waiting on God, and do what I say, not do as I do. And so she thought the second option was better. Both are true. Waiting on God. Isaiah 40:31 says, "They who wait upon the Lord, their strength will be renewed. They shall mount up with wings like eagles." Jesus waits 30 years before moving out into ministry. And even when he knows that that's the time and God has called him into that moment and he's baptized and the Holy Spirit descends on him, what does he do? He waits 40 more days. He goes out into the wilderness. And it's in those moments when he's in the wilderness where he's tempted about thinking about upward mobility. Isn't that exactly what the enemy, the prosecuting attorney, the Satan himself shows up and offers him 3 different opportunities for upward mobility. And every single time Jesus says, I will wait upon God. I will rest in God. Stays in the present. He's fully attentive to what God's will is and what the world really needs. Jesus meditates upon the will of God day and night, and when tempted to save the whole world through political power, through economic power, through feeding them on a hillside. They wanted to make him king that day. When he fed them bread and fish, he waits. And he does not act to get ahead, but in fact he empties himself, as Paul says in Philippians. He's there to honor God in the individual. He rescues us because he is willing to wait and to rest. We see this in the example of Lazarus, is that he has all of his disciples. He has Mary and Martha coming to him and said, if you hadn't waited, he wouldn't have died. Why couldn't you just heal him at that moment? And Jesus knows that waiting for God's timing is the best timing of all. Jesus says, wait. He says, if you're going to be my disciple, you're going to have to wait. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek, lowly of heart. Again, this downward mobility. And he says, you will find rest. Rest for your souls with my teaching, to wait on God. And there's something different. Sometimes what we do is we think that what we're doing is waiting on God, but what we do, in fact, is that we're waiting for a particular purpose. Right? I'm waiting for God to give me direction in this particular area. Or I'm waiting for God to live up to my expectations. I'm waiting for God to answer my prayer in this particular way. And that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, don't wait for something. Jesus exemplifies this attitude of non-striving from the idea of saying, no, the teaching is to just simply wait on God. No expectations, just expectancy. God has a different perspective. God has a different viewing angle than we do. Jesus waits on God the Father. And so we come to this moment and we say to ourselves, well, how do we know? How do we know when to act and what to do? You tell us to wait on God, then when's the opportunity to act? And when's the opportunity to do? Am I just simply supposed to meditate and wait? Then we come to Micah 6. And Micah 6 actually sums it up for us. He's shown you, O mortal, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. Do justice, love loving kindness, and walk humbly. Again, it's right there. Non-striving, downward mobility. Walk humbly with God. So there's so many people that are out there waiting on God, but really the game plan's right there, right in front of us each day. If we act with loving kindness, if we act with mercy, if we do justice, then we're already in that moment of still being able to wait for God. It's when we ignore these. I'm a poster child of ignoring these, right? It's when we ignore those that we move out of waiting on God and we start that idea that I have to advance, I have to move forward, I have to fix things, I have to obtain things. And Jesus acts, of course, but Jesus isn't doing it from a striving standpoint. He's acting and doing in order to allow God to be seen in this world so that others may believe. He didn't raise Lazarus from the dead in order for him to have upward mobility, in order for him to be made king, in order for people to do anything other than to believe in God and believe also in the word that he was speaking. Amazing miracles. Were these striving, working? No. He raises Lazarus so that it would be seen that Jesus has power over life and death. So what about you and me? Here's our exercise. What are you striving for? Just pause for a minute and think about this. What are you striving for? What are you trying to get in life? Can you trust God with that? Can you hand that over to God so that you may wait and rest on him? All of our expectations, all of our attitudes of fixing, always looking ahead, always looking behind, rarely present. So how do we do this? Right? How do we do this? How do we move into this example of Jesus of non-striving? How do we wait on God? We reschedule our lives. Right? The rich young man shows up to Jesus and asks Jesus, what must I do in order to inherit this life eternal? And Jesus says, no, get rid of everything that encumbers you. Sell all of your possessions and give it to the poor, and then come follow me. And the man went away dejected, despairing, for he had many, many things. It says that Jesus loved him. This is what it comes down to for me. It's really a no-brainer for me. I know what I have to do. I have to reschedule my life, reprioritize, so that I'm waiting on God and not trying to get things or obtain things or fix things on my own. The best way that we can do this is, there's this interesting little concept that we find in the Old Testament, New Testament, Sabbath. Have you heard of this? It's number 4. In the 10 Commandments, it's number 4. And yet, I'm more concerned about some of the ones that are in the lower range rather than the number 4. Resting. A day set aside for God. To wait on God. To live my life in such a way that the 6 days of my life are prepping for a day of rest. Creating, resting, this rhythm of life that God offers out to us. This, by far, is the best way, the most biblical way that is given to us, that we can move into a mode of non-striving and waiting on God. So I just encourage you this week to just be thinking about this in your mind and in your heart, to think on these things. How can you move into an attitude more deeply of waiting on God, resting, trusting, downward mobility? May all of these things come to pass as we move more deeply into following Jesus Christ. May it be so.